Hi, and welcome to CryptoBiography. I'm your host, Brandon Starr. This is episode 233 of CryptoBiography, and it is part 2 of the Isle of Bronze. However, this is essentially the beginning of the actual story. Part 1 was some of the mythology and history of the island where this story is going to take place. And so, whether you want to listen to that or not is your prerogative, and if you want to start just with the story, you may start with this episode. And here we go. A clear, cool autumn sky brightened as the brother's sun rose. The palace received its rays, but was not yet warmed by them. The king, Narasmin, was already robed, but alone in his garden. At least, he was as alone as he could be, for his guards were all along the exits to the garden, and if he so much as coughed, they would come running. Still, there were places where he could walk or sit and not see another human. He could look at the lush bushes and trees from 3 different continents, as well as from all over his island kingdom, and feel at peace. This was part of his routine, which he observed as often as his schedule allowed, but sometimes it was interrupted, as it was today. The sounds of feet on the gravel paths grew louder. Narasmin knew it was a child, and then knew it was one of his children. He thought it was his eldest. Soon, from around the closest bend in the path, his eldest did run, a look of some excitement on his face. When he saw his father looking at him, he slowed down to a quick but more dignified walk. "Shugo," he said to his son with a nod, letting him know he could drop the formality. His son trotted up to him. "Father?" he said. Narasmin looked at him. His son was looking up, waiting for him to speak. "What brings you to the garden?" he asked. "Can I not be here, hoping to enjoy your company?" his son asked. "He wishes to have a more casual relationship with me," Narasmin thought, but he also recognizes the sort of relationship we need to have. His heart warmed. "You may," he said, "but I don't think that's the only reason you're here." "Wise as Father Earth, as always, Father." Shugo let a half-grin momentarily cross his face. "The lanterns say ships are approaching. Theban. Non-hostile." "Thank you, son." Shugo was taking this as a dismissal and turning to go. Normally it would have been. "Wait." Shugo stopped. He had already half turned away, and Narasmin saw that his profile looked a lot like his own as it appeared on his coins. His beard was just starting to come in, having still the patchiness of youth. He thought about his words even more carefully than he normally did. Non-hostile ships from a city-state that had an emissary sent to us 3 months ago. This should be interesting. I'm assuming it's another delegation. I will receive them in the main audience chamber. I want you there in your best robes, he said. You need say nothing, but observe everything. When it is over, you will tell me what you saw. Shugo's eyes widened briefly. Then he bowed and said, with more than a hint of excitement and pride, "Thank you, Father. I will be there." He almost scrambled away in his excitement, only a bare hint of him remembering his need for comportment keeping him from positively sprinting back to his rooms. He never looked back to see Narasmin's beaming smile. I'll say that again. He never looked back to see Narasmin's beaming smile. But the smile didn't last. Narasmin thought on the Theban delegation and what it might mean. Something had changed. But what, and what did it mean? Were the Thebans going to ask for his help with a new problem? Threaten his own island of Limos? Warn him of something? He thought on what this news could be, but thinking back on his last meeting with the Thebans did not help. They seemed to have little new to offer at that time. Well, if it was a threat they were going to give, or a danger they were going to warn of, it would have to be a big one to put any fear into him. Their island, long ago, had had a violent history full of various invasions and takeovers, but once tin had been discovered and their island turned to a bronze fortress, they'd known centuries of peace and prosperity. Their island had been a place of calm, while the world around them had known centuries of tumult. Coming to the conclusion that his memory would not give him foreknowledge of whatever it was the Thebans wished to say, he let out a long breath to calm himself and slowly walked back to the garden entrance to the palace. He could tell immediately that the word had gone around the palace about the upcoming meeting. There was a stirring and a slight susurrus from behind other doors of his people preparing in various ways. 2 guards stepped in 3 paces behind him. They'd been awaiting his return from the garden, whenever it was. It had been shortened by the news his son had brought, yet he found he did not mind. These meetings, as straining as they were also full of information, and no doubt would give him items to think on for many days. Of course, not everything would be taken at face value. Everything this emissary had to say would have to be considered, sifted, and pondered for lies, layers, and meanings. With the guards still 3 paces behind, he went back to his chambers. He stepped in, and the guards waited at the door. The changing women had also been alerted, and they were there, prepared. They helped him off with his daily robes, for, fine as they were, he would need his best for the meeting. At the moment he was naked, his mind drifted. He enjoyed the feeling of the cool air on his skin. But he was expected to be resplendent at all times, so this moment was fleeting. Soon his best robes, with their threads of dark wine, yellow, and green, had been brought, and the various layers put on him. The colors on the back formed the royal symbol of the island, the crab. Its pincers reached up almost to the shoulder, as though it were itself touching the king in an assenting way. The dressers then brought out combs and made sure his beard and hair, both long and flowing, were groomed to perfection. He was in his 40s, and gray hair crept in around his temples. And he had noticed the hair on top of his head was thinning. These things were unavoidable, natural, and expected, but what they meant couldn't be ignored. Then the dressers left, and he went to his scroll case and pulled out the scroll from the last Theban visit, and then went to his most comfortable chair. He read and reread his notes he had taken after their last meeting. Their emissary, Hermocritus, was overweight, about 50 years old, but well-dressed, intelligent, and clever. Narasmin reminded himself to be even more careful than usual about letting any information slip. He also remembered Hermocritus's way of speech, and knew that the Theban emissary would be doing the same thing. The last time they were here, they were hoping to bargain for better prices for Limus's bronze. This had been a theme for as long as Narasmin had been king, and before. He had seen similar attempts from Thebes and many other places since the first meetings his own father had allowed him to witness. Perhaps half of the meetings revolved around this subject. However, since most of the royal income revolved around bronze and around exporting and importing, he had to be very careful to get a good price for the metal, of great use in war and peace. So his favorite move was to keep the prices on the bronze nearly the same, while giving some lavish gifts to the emissary and the king they represented. The price of the gifts was high, but very small compared to a real reduction in the price of the metal. Of course, the emissaries and the kings, at least the wise ones, caught on to this, but they really had little leverage, and so they left with their pride, if not their purses, intact, with a wagon or 2 of pricey baubles to make them feel like it was a fair trade. It was something he had learned from both directions, he mused. People will forgive much, if at least their pride is not damaged. But even a small slight is too much to bear if their pride has been wounded along with it. Due to this lesson, he'd removed as much of his pride from himself as he could. He was no longer affronted emotionally when someone slighted him. Unfortunately, this could not apply to all parts of his life, as it might some other person. As king, he had to maintain some appearances, and those could not be publicly broken. Still, it had often been a great help to him to keep this from becoming a personal issue, so when someone slighted him, he never took it personally. But if it affected his public persona, he dealt with it. He had been hoping that his notes might jog some idea or some memory that would tell him what to expect, but nothing came. He was pondering this fact when the door opened and his wife, Mawaya, was wheeled in. Mawaya was a few years younger than him, still beautiful, but often in pain, which showed as strain in her dark brown eyes. Something had gone badly wrong during the birth of their last child, and she had been unable to walk well ever since. Recently, Narasmin had had a chair made with wheels, which would allow her to get around and regain some of her dignity. He remembered when he first met her. Many kings had already met their future queens at some point during their lives, or even knew them well. But not Narasmin. He had met Mawaya during his Unity search, the event that young men of the island took on when nearing adulthood to seek one who would make the best primary marriage partner for them, and one who felt the same in return. Narasmin had never heard of another kingdom that had the princes look for their brides among all the young women of the land, and not just the nobility. Indeed, because of this tradition, Limos had no real nobility outside of the king's immediate family. There were, however, powerful families controlling all or some or all of various enterprises across the island, and they tended to have healthy, better educated, and therefore often more attractive girls. But by tradition, every prince was expected to scour the island, and because of this, there had never been a full shut-off between the royals and the rest of society. Mawaya had been a fisherman's daughter, not educated at that time, though she had learned once she had married Narasmin. She had been average height, but muscular from a life of helping her father with his nets, skin bronzed and fingers quick and clever. He had simply seen her from a distance and went up to her while she was mending a tear in her father's net. Her eyes were dark and clear and seemed to him to see right through him. Other girls had tried music or dance or various kinds of artistry to draw his eye. Mawaya had not tried to impress him at all. She simply talked to him, apparently not caring he was the eldest prince and would someday almost certainly have the throne. But there was something in her intelligence, her occasional hard-earned smile, and even her presence that made the rest of his search moot. He had gone back to her again and again, and it quickly became clear to all, except perhaps Mawaya herself, that he wanted her for his bride. Or perhaps she did know, for when she asked her to come back to the palace, she accepted graciously, but also immediately. He did not find out until after they were married, but she had also been attracted to him in her turn. Polyamory of many kinds was common, not just for the kings, but amongst all the people of the island, but polygamy was not possible for a king, as there had to be a clear line of succession. So though he could have taken other women to his bed, if not as a wife, Narasmin did not want to. After her injury, when she was nursing their infant son, Mawaya had given him leave to take lovers, as coitus was now painful for her. But he found he wanted no other woman. Instead, he focused on the future of the island, its people, and their children, and, for the most part, he was satisfied. And that's the episode for this week. I hope you enjoyed it. I certainly have enjoyed writing it. If you have any comments or questions about this episode or previous episodes, CryptoBiography@gmail.com, or hit us up on Facebook or Twitter. And thanks for listening. Words and music copyright 2021, CryptoBiography LLC, all rights reserved. Characters and events are fictional, fictionalized, or satirical.